The third of the video lessons. We are still in the morass, the quagmire, as it were, of the background / paragraph about Weimar failures. Like all of them, this will only ever be one paragraph. Do not sweat about doing too much stuff. A lot of this is for context and background, just indulgence, to be honest. But we're looking today at how did the economic problems up till 1930, the ones result around the Great Depression, will be a completely separate thing because that is its own paragraph. How did that and also the cultural changes lead to Hitler? And that's very crude. Lead indirectly, largely, to the situation which then enabled Hitler to come to power. So we're going to start with economic changes. Primarily, we can focus on two types of economic things. The first is hyperinflation in 1923. So hopefully you have some sort of awareness of hyperinflation. That's when the value of money became worthless, and there's all sorts of stories of sort of wheelbarrows of cash and etc, etc, etc. Now, obviously, the first thing to mention is we don't care about the short-term impact, really, because that doesn't really lead to Hitler, and we only care about impacts that help lead to Hitler. So, who were affected by hyperinflation? If you are middle class, a civil servant or a pensioner, you particularly suffer. Now, I'll explain why. Not everyone in this era had a salary, in that you are paid X amount of money per year. That was actually relatively rare in this period, at least in Germany. The idea that you were contracted and like a civil servant or many other middle classes, that you would get paid X amount per year, was largely confined to these groups. Working class people were often paid by the week or the month on a very much an hourly basis. So therefore it's a bit more flexible, and it can be renegotiated quite quickly. Whereas if you're middle class or civil servants, you can't massively, unless you leave your job, renegotiate your salary. You can wait until your contract's up if you're in a certain job where they have that and talk about it then. Whereas workers is a lot more easy, a lot more responsive, and it can almost change every week as you get paid each week. Likewise, if you own a business, as you see, that's not massively as affected. So these people, they have a fixed amount of money. So say that's 35 grand, or say they get 35,000 marks, they get paid, or actually at this point it's probably more like 12,000 marks. But now, because of hyperinflation, as we can see in the last slide, the value of money massively declines. Now, hopefully, for a quick rundown of inflation, you should remember Freddo bars and how much they cost when you were young. When I was young, they cost about 10p. Now they are 20 quid or something like that here. That is inflation. When something gets more expensive, money is slightly less valuable. That's a real crude summary. It's actually not what it is, but that's enough for us. Hyperinflation is when that happens hugely quickly. And if you have kind of look, the value of money declines precipitously between January 1922 and January 1923 and November also in 1923. In that time, if you are getting paid a good salary of 12,000 marks, that is now worthless. If you have a look, 12,000 white marks in 1919 could have bought you a lot of gold, and now it won't even get you a speck of gold in that period. Likewise, it's even worse for pensioners, and particularly, this is also why it's bad for middle classes, people who are getting a pension. Okay, the way pensions work in this period, really crudely and simplistically, and it's not actually how they work, but for the purposes of this, is you put money away. It goes, in this case, mostly to the state. They say, well, you've put X amount in. Say you put in 100 marks a month. We will match that, say, by another 100 marks. And at the end of the year, at the end of your career in 35 years' time, we'll add up all that 200 marks, and that's how much your pension is. So say you got 2 days till retirement, and you've saved up month after month after month, 100 marks, plus you got your bit extra, and it's now worth, let's say, 200,000 marks. That would be enough to live on. Except, no, it's not! Look, it's worthless. It's now completely worthless. All that money that you've been saving for years and years and years, and now can't buy you an ounce of gold. Had you got that sort of pension from in 1919, you could have bought a lot of gold with that, and now you can't buy anything with your 200,000 marks. Now, in reality, workers are too poor for pensions, and the rich tended to buy property or land rather than in order to pay for their old age, as opposed to pension schemes. So again, it massively hits the middle classes. Other groups, as mentioned, does not hit so much. The working classes, it's bad, but they get paid per week, and so their wages change. And in reality, they're relatively poor anyway, so they don't have luxuries, and they definitely don't have pensions. The rich, some actually do very well. They borrow a lot of money, and they usually have borrowed a lot of money. If you borrowed a load of money from a bank, say you bought 1 million marks to buy a new factory, as someone called Hugo Steens did, now you can pay that back really easily. That's pocket change. And usually most banks didn't have clauses in there for hyperinflation, so that's not great for them. Some banks did fail as a result. As well as that, a lot of the Junkers didn't have that much cash. A lot of their money was tied up in land, darling, which basically means that they didn't actually, although they had some funds which are now worthless, they still had their land at the end. And once hyperinflation finished, and if we have a look at the dates, in reality, after November 1930, it very quickly, as a result, Stresemann goes back to normal. Their land is still there and still has that value. Some people who own property or have got stuff mortgaged, and it's important to realize that having a mortgage isn't a massively middle class thing. It's more of an upper middle class thing and an upper class thing in this period. You bought a house for, say, $1 million, and now you paid off your house really easily. So actually, if you're wealthy, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Also remember that, yes, it's a bad crisis, but by November, the crisis is pretty much over. So the date, compared to the Great Depression, which lasts 3 years and is terrible, it's bad for people, but it doesn't grindingly go on forever. And so people don't necessarily lose hope as much as they do in the Great Depression. So what is the impact of this? Ultimately, there isn't a revolution. Hitler tries a coup to try and expand on this. It doesn't necessarily work. And therefore, there's less damage in the short term. The danger and the damage is in long term. A government that allows hyperinflation to happen is seen as a bad government. Therefore, if we go back to that constant thing we keep coming back to, explaining why people would decide to vote against democracy in the end, this, if you're new to democracy, did not happen under the Kaiser and is associated with the weakness and the ineptitude of democratic politicians and can only serve to harm the legitimacy of democracy and contribute to that cynicism. And arguably, you can say this does contribute to cynicism toward democracy. Certainly during the crisis, there is increased votes for parties such as the Nazis and the DNVP, although that vote does drop in 1924 and goes even further down in 1928 in the next election for that. So it's not necessarily permanent, but it definitely leads to a sense of people dabbling in extreme parties. I would say particularly important, though, are the impact it has on the political culture. These people who are particularly badly affected, civil servants, older people, middle classes, were actually, in many ways, the core group of moderate supports. They didn't necessarily love democracy, but they were the ones, unlike the working classes, who were more often than not communist, and unlike the upper classes who were more often than not nationalist, these were the ones in the middle who generally were prepared to accept democracy. These are the ones who are particularly bad affected, and these are the ones who therefore are most likely to view the government as negative. So almost this crisis is perfectly targeted to the last people who could possibly keep democracy alive. And we really see a support of the middle amongst the middle classes against the democratic process in Weimar really start to drain in this period. As well as this, many people look upon what happens in 1920 and remember what happened in 1930, and it does help add to this sense of panic and sort of crisis. So that's the first part of the economic, the hyperinflation. The second part looks at 1924 to 1930. Now, in summary, it's not so bad. Essentially, what happens is a guy called Stresemann decides that he is going to deal with the crisis, and he basically joins into government. And the way he deals with the crisis is under something called the Dawes Plan. He gets loans from America to help finance the economy. There are other things involved, that's the most important part. Okay. He establishes a new currency called the Rentenmark, and he cuts some public sector jobs to try and cut how much money is going out compared to how much is going in. It doesn't massively work. It is very easy, therefore, to say that because of this led to loans. And as mentioned before, the loans are what caused the Great Depression, as we will explore later. So therefore, this causes the Great Depression. And since the Great Depression arguably causes Hitler, this causes Hitler in turn. I would say that is a bit simple. We've already gone through it for the last lesson. But if you remember, everyone knew that relying on loans on its own is a bad idea. And they accepted that. Rent Stresemann said they shouldn't do that. This was a temporary measure to get them on their feet. However, because of the weakness of politicians, they could never really do the next stage. They could never do anything big to try and change the economy, because that would upset someone and then break up their coalition. So although this is, yes, part of the story, there are wiser reasons why the loans are not stopped being used and are allowed to continue, and therefore causing problems. So, in this period after 1924, there is some evidence of stability, and you have the statistics in your books from the class. But they are, and if not, go to the reading sheets on the Edmodo, Google Classroom, or whatever I'm using when you're listening to this. But in reality, they have a much better controlled monetary policy. There are rising real wages, more stuff's being made, more stuff's being exported. There's a bit more growth, and there's more foreign capital. So if you look at those things, there is good times, happy times, all good. However, there are fundamental economic problems, and I'll put them into 3 different areas. Even though it looks good about growth, there is still big problems, particularly at the working class level. Okay, unemployment is always above 1 million and rises even before the Depression. Average worker does see an increase in wages, but he also sees an increase in taxes and inflation, so they sort of like cost neutral each other out. And Germany isn't necessarily doing massively well compared to the rest of the world. As well as this, the economic situation between 1924 and 1930 only exists because of loans. That's not good in the long term. As soon as those loans are gone, bad times, as we shall see. The amount of trade that's being happening is not good. Businesses are forming cartels. What that means is, rather than having lots of different companies making shoes and competing with each other, one big company creating a cartel of basically having a monopoly of the market, a control of the market, so they can charge whatever they want. As well as this, as mentioned before, the government spends far too much money and taxes far less, but because they don't want to upset the left or right wing by either raising taxes or reducing spending, they just keep doing it, and therefore there's a massive government deficit. The bottom 2 are what I really care about. From 1926, from 1922, in fact, the price of wheat massively crashes. It takes a few years before it really starts causing damage, but in reality, by 1926, most rural areas are in massive economic depression. So while there is perhaps growth and wealth in the cities, particularly amongst the middle classes, to a lesser extent the workers, the rural areas are actually actively becoming poorer. And there is widespread rural poverty even before this period. And what we see, particularly, is a Nazi vote in between 1924 and 1930 really rises amongst these poor rural areas. And that's really good evidence to suggest that the Nazis are a protest vote against the economic uncertainty, where the Nazi vote is very low elsewhere, but in areas which are suffering economic hardship, people start voting Nazi. Okay, it's like a taster of what happens before the Great Depression. As well as that, the Mittelstand are struggling, partly because they're always struggling, partly because the loans mean there's more factories, which means there's more competition. If there's more factories, if you're a cobbler, if you are an artisan carpenter, your business is being undermined by factories who can make more stuff, make it cheaper than you can, and therefore there's a lot of Mittelstand who start struggling. And we see a massive, and it's been disputed how many, but there's a massive decline in the number of Mittelstand businesses in this period. So they are under economic strain, and unsurprisingly, these are the same groups who vote Nazi. So yes, there is good times and there is some growth funded largely by short-term loans, but there are deep issues in certain sectors, particularly amongst the working classes, particularly in the idea of the government is storing up economic problems, and most importantly in rural areas and amongst the Mittelstand, who are suffering from, let's be honest, the changes of modernity as competition spikes. Now, there are a couple of things I want to say about economics in particular. One thing that happens as a result of the Treaty of Versailles and then the loans which follow it in the Dawes Plan is the Young Plan. Under the Dawes Plan, Germany didn't have to start paying loans and paying back the reparations until 1929. The aim was to give them breathing room so that they could build up their economy, then they'll be richer, and then they'll be able to pay off their reparations and everyone will be happy. The Young Plan, they were worried that now it was about to start in 1929 and the economy wasn't ready for it. So what the Young Plan was essentially they will extend the amount of time they have to pay back the money. That means you have to pay less per year, and also to reduce the amount of money they had to pay by 500 million marks. If this was passed, the French would also agree to leave the Rhineland and therefore make the government look like it's done something good. Now, the Young Plan was in theory passed by the Reichstag. However, there was a challenge to it, and part of the constitution said that if you could get enough support for a referendum, you could have one. And the DMVP, Alfred Hugenberg, you can see in the picture there on the left-hand side, managed to build up a coalition of weirdos and right-wingers to basically get a referendum running. And this referendum became about fulfilment, i.e., do we do the Young Plan and accept the Treaty of Versailles, boo, hiss, SPD, November criminals, or do we follow the brave DMVP and their friends and say, no, we reject the Treaty of Versailles, come at us, bro. In reality, this was never going to work, and it doesn't really matter. The only reason why it matters, and this is a nice smug point, is Hugenberg is desperate to make this look like it's not just a DMVP, it's a mass right-wing effort. And Hugenberg also is a massive media baron who controls lots of the press. In order to get this to look like a legitimate, wide-supporting belief, he starts inviting other groups, including Adolf Hitler. This is Adolf Hitler's real first time of national media representation. It makes him a household name. It gives him a national spotlight amongst a press who wants to make him look good. And you can argue that this is the start, really, of the rise of Hitler, because it really starts developing the Nazis as a mass party and a legitimate party. Without the Young Plan, there's no reason for Hugenberg to start giving lots of articles, particularly positive articles, and standing next to Hitler in this period. Now, the referendum was defeated. It was always going to be defeated. Even right-wingers realise that they need the Young Plan because it's just such a good deal. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. As mentioned, really, 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 really important. Rural areas, very poor from 1926. Lot of distress. Massive increase in radical voting before this. You will get no clear evidence that a lot of the protest votes were based to economic causes rather than anything else. Related to this, as mentioned, there are many working class problems, and the wages of working classes don't raise up as much. There, therefore, is a lot of industrial unrest in Germany, lots of strikes, quite a bit of violence in this period, with 15% of the workforce unemployed. This encourages the rise of KPD, and the KPD gets a little bit stronger and a little bit more sympathy. And so that means when the Great Depression comes, they're in a really good place. So we're seeing, as a result of this, a rise of the KPD. Now, without going into too much detail, the KPD being big terrifies Germans into voting for the Nazis. It's really simple. We're going into far more detail. Just trust me on this. So you can say that actually the industrial unrest arguably leads to a rise of the KPD, which in turn only encourages more people to vote for Hitler. So, summary. It looks good on the outside, but there are real problems in the German economy which will come back to bite them in 1930, and there are decline in euro areas and from Mittelstand. Most of the problems were ignored because the government could not deal with it without causing a crashing of the coalition. How does this lead to Hitler? It will lead to the crash equals Hitler. Also, it does help build support over time, or at least sympathy, so they don't necessarily vote there and then, but they are more willing to entertain the idea of voting, / Great Depression turns up, definitely going to do it, than before. Right, we're going to move on to culture. I love why I'm at culture. I will talk to you in class about it for ages, but in reality it's a side point, so you don't really need to worry. Essentially, one of the most interesting cultural periods of the 20th century, in my humble, well-informed opinion, is the Weimar era, between 1919 and 1930s. And essentially what happens is there is a massive change in brand new art, brand new culture, brand new films. Everything is new in this period, completely against convention. Now, there's lots of theories why. Part of it is after World War One, many men went off to war as young men and saw their friends die, questioned the whole basis of humanity, morality, the meaning of life, and they come back and they make art about it. As well as that, because the conservative regime under the Kaiser was gone and free speech was created, there's no more censorship. So therefore people could try and experiment and push the boundaries. Because there was lots of loans, people could afford to go out. Credit is loans. And therefore there's an economic boom, and therefore if there's an economic boom, people buy art, they build new houses, they go to the cinema, they listen to jazz, etc., etc. As well as that, in areas where there is political chaos, there's lots of ideas going around, there's lots of intellectual things. That makes for brilliant art. The best art and culture is from eras where there is chaos and drama. Sedate, calm areas, it's all very mundane, usually landscapes, not very exciting. As well as that, the USA is becoming a real thing which exports culture to Germany, and there is the rise of films and radio which gets more people involved in culture and therefore expands it. Now, I have only a few examples of Weimar culture. You will never need to list any of them. But just so you can get it fixed in your head, Weimar culture is all about pushing boundaries, destroying the old value system, almost deliberately challenging the old value system of what is morally right, what's morally wrong, what is art and what is not art, in order crudely to stimulate or cause a reaction from left, sort of the Germans, also from the elite, or just to show and experience true humanity. Think of it as the end of repression. So we see, for example, the rise of female entertainers and female actresses who are not mere passive roles. They are semi-feminist icons. This is the era of the noir, the femme fatale. The most intelligent person in the film is usually the woman. Okay? Very interesting thing. Challenges the gender norms. Obviously, as you can imagine, frowned upon. We see the rise of jazz and those sort of music. We see the rise of jazz dancing and that sort of unsocially acceptable dancing and clothing, which seems too sexually promiscuous and amoral. This here, for example, is a famous picture. You will notice these are African Americans who are playing jazz. Jazz was associated with African Americans, and therefore it shows not only an importation of a different culture, the US, where jazz is from, well, ish, but also other races, as you can imagine. Not everyone is giddy to see this. As well as that, we see the rise of different art. Otto Diesch here, one of Mr. Suter's favourite artists, although obviously this is a little bit haunting. They are all about capturing the emotion. Before this, war scenes were about glory and generals. The changing in art was about questioning the big things, supporting pacifism, showing the dirt under the fingernails, the morality, the murder, the negative side behind war. And this obviously can be seen as very exposing, and this is very therapeutic for many soldiers who fought in World War One. But at the same time, you can see why it had problems. Film was created with slightly more sexual themes, slightly more negative themes. This is the era where films are about pimps, they're about prostitutes, they're about criminals, gangsters, they're about robots, and they adopt an aesthetic which is deliberately anti-realistic. This is seen from Metropolis, for example. We see cabaret, and also a sort of a reinterpretation of gender and sexuality. For example, with the Weimar Republic has an office for transgender issues. I cannot think of any pre-1970 states that had an official government platform for transgender issues. I think so. Remarkably progressive, and as you can imagine, more conservative Germans were really not happy to see that. Obviously, the Bauhaus architecture, and as well as, so here's some more art. This is some war veterans showing the destruction to humanity caused by the war. So it is very easy to say, oh yeah, it's really good because it's liberal and it's creating more. In reality, we look back on this and say this is great. This shows lots of democratization. We recognize this sort of art. It's much more interesting, much more personal than perhaps what the other German art is, which is manual paintings, very dull books. That's our subjective Western liberal middle class opinion. In reality, some people loved it, absolutely loved it. They saw it as avant-garde, they saw it new, and they really embraced it. This, in reality, was largely an urban, and I would say even then, largely Berlin, middle-class liberal cohort. We're talking maximum 5 to 10% of the population. You think of the amount of people you know who, or people in society who will perhaps go to Tate Modern and enjoy it, and understand it, or really embrace it and get really involved in modern art and modern cinema. I really suggest you do get involved in sort of art house cinema. It's very interesting. But these sort of people are actually a very small minority. They're not. Most people will be watching the television and watching soaps or dramas, or and not looking at modern art, but have a fair, more traditional point of art. The exact same, even more so, is true in Germany. There are people who embrace it and love it, but they are very much in a minority. To the average German, this is a sign of the decline of Germany under democracy. Okay, they see, unlike modern art, women acting promiscuously, not acting as good wives or mothers, the decline of the nuclear family. They see racial inferiority, and they see racial mixing and the perversion of the German blood with different racial elements, and also the effect of the US soldier. They see pacifism, and they see sexualization, and they see challenges to the norms which society is founded on. And they see that as a threat to the ultimate Germanness. And this is absolutely essential to the narrative of many of the right-wing parties. And I would say the vast majority of Germans fall into the right category here. The idea that this is not a good thing. This is evidence that Germany is losing its way. Under the unlimited freedom of democracy, the weakness of democracy, the people have run amok. We are in Sodom and Gomorrah. We are not in good times. And so when politicians on the right, including Hitler, says, we will deal with this filth, we will go back to true German values, we will deal with the breakdown of society, people believe it. They buy into it. So what does this essentially mean? If we are going to say how culture helps or culture leads to Hitler, it creates a situation where the vast majority of Germans, particularly those in rural areas, particularly those who are upper elitists, yes, but even some more traditional conservative middle classes, particularly the more religious middle classes, and even some working classes, they look upon what's happening in Weimar and they see the country's going to the dogs. And I think we might all know someone who views even modern society now and what's happening as a decline in civilization. This is happening. This is what is on TV now. This is what's acceptable for X, Y, Z social groups to do. Isn't this disgusting? Isn't this good? Isn't this bad? Sorry. All that sort of stuff. The exact same narrative, except for it's pretty much everyone at this period. And so you can get a lot of votes and sympathy from this. And arguably one of the big factors that leads to the Catholic Party, who at the start of this course was socially conservative but economically liberal, becoming more right-wing, was a fear that Christian culture was being undermined through, among other things, culture and society that we've looked at today. It's not just that, but that's part of it. So, we can explain a rise in the sympathy for right-wing extremists as a reaction to the cultural experimentation, which is seen as evidence of the weakness of democracy, the corruption of democracy, and therefore a yearning for life under the Kaiser, when the art was pure, when we had Wagner, not jazz, and women knew their place. So, this is the big thing. There is a sense that democracy corrupts German values. If you want that vote from those people who are very often middle classes, centrist or conservative, but not necessarily extreme, you say you will correct that. Okay? That is the worst middle bullet point I've ever seen. This was then politicized by the right to gain support from not radical, but socially conservative Germans. I don't know why that conservative is also capitalized. I'm clearly tired. So it gets their vote. And therefore, related to that, the cynicism towards democracy only increases. Very, very brief lesson, very quick. Do not worry too much. I would really be surprised if either of these, particularly culture, ever equates to anything in your world and your essays, but it's well worth knowing nonetheless. Until next lesson, where we start finally getting a little bit closer and we start slowing down quite a lot because now we're in testable territory. we start looking at something I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's important. Until next video, I will see you then.